He did a version of Stairway that had a choir and an orchestra, and then after the guitar, well, it was with the...
In the dim-lit corridors of rock and roll legend, there lies a story few dare to tell, a story not of riffs and records, but of rivalry, resentment, and raw ego. Behind the mystique of Led Zeppelin's thunderous sound stood a man whose genius was matched only by his intolerance for anything less than perfection. Jimmy Page, the spellbinding guitarist who conjured up sonic storms like Stairway to Heaven and Whole Lotta Love, wasn't just a musical visionary, he was also a notoriously unforgiving critic of his contemporaries. While fans celebrated him as a guitar god, insiders whispered of a far darker truth. Page held quiet but intense grudges against several of the most famous guitarists in rock history. These weren't casual rivalries or playful competition. These were deeply rooted conflicts fueled by artistic disdain, bruised egos, and clashing visions of what guitar music should be. Page reportedly believed that, while many could play, only a rare few could understand. A philosophical wedge that put him at odds with 6 of the most celebrated names in the business. Whether it was a clash over style, showmanship, or authenticity, each feud peeled back another layer of Page's guarded persona, exposing the storm beneath the surface. Some of these rivalries flared behind closed studio doors. Others unfolded through biting quotes in music magazines. Passive-aggressive snubs backstage, or cold silences that echoed louder than any guitar solo. These weren't mere disagreements. They were wars of ideology between titans who helped define generations. Now, for the first time, we'll peel back the velvet curtain and dive into the 6 guitarists who reportedly made Jimmy Page's blood boil. From flamboyant showmen to minimalist bluesmen, from lightning-fast technicians to blues purists, each one committed, in Page's eyes, a different kind of artistic sin. The names may surprise you, the reasons may shock you, and what Page allegedly said about them will challenge everything you thought you knew about the man behind the myth. Because beneath the swagger and mysticism of rock's most enigmatic guitarist was a perfectionist so exacting, a purist, so fiercely protective of his musical legacy, that even the gods of guitar weren't safe from his wrath. Get ready, because what you're about to hear isn't just a list. It's a reckoning. Asterisk to understand Jimmy Page's seething disdain for certain fellow guitarists. You have to first understand the obsessive, almost mystical way he viewed music itself. Page wasn't just playing guitar, he was conjuring spirits, building sonic cathedrals with every riff, layering harmonics like a painter obsessed with texture, color, and shadow. From his earliest days as a session musician to his reign at the top of Led Zeppelin, he maintained an almost sacred belief in what music should be: authentic, intentional, and emotionally transcendent. This belief forged an uncompromising perfectionist, who viewed guitar not as a tool for ego, but as a spiritual conduit one that should never be sullied by gimmicks or cheap theatrics. And it's exactly this unwavering standard that positioned him as both a pioneer and a harsh judge. Page famously remarked in a 1975 interview, "There are guitarists who play, and there are guitarists who understand," before concluding with a brutal observation: most fall into the first category. Unfortunately, that single quote, echoed in industry circles for years, became the unspoken mantra behind every feud that followed. For Page, it wasn't enough to shred or to dazzle, it had to mean something. It had to come from the soul, be steeped in history, grounded in the roots of blues and British folk, then elevated into something transcendent. Anything else, be it flashy solos, excessive speed, or hollow showmanship, was seen as a betrayal of the craft. Page's perfectionism didn't just manifest in the studio, where he would spend countless hours fine-tuning the smallest detail, but also in how he evaluated others. He didn't tolerate sloppiness, nor did he forgive those who he felt chased fame over musical truth. To him, real artistry required reverence, discipline, and above all, integrity. And when other guitarists, some of them wildly successful, dared to break those codes, Page didn't just notice, he remembered. Some might argue that his contempt was fueled by insecurity, that deep down he feared being eclipsed by younger, flashier rivals. But to those who knew him best, it was never about fear. it was about principles. He believed that the guitar was a sacred language, and too many were speaking it with hollow mouths. Page's fury wasn't loud or public. It burned silently behind piercing eyes, released in offhanded remarks to journalists, whispered critiques to fellow musicians, or the deliberate cold shoulder backstage. And it was through this lens of unrelenting perfectionism that 6 legendary guitarists would fall from his grace, from his standards, and in some cases, from his respect altogether. Because when Jimmy Page found you guilty of violating the unwritten code of true musicianship, there was no forgiveness. Only silence or scorn. Asterisk when it comes to the long lineage of iconic British guitarists. Few names are as revered as Ritchie Blackmore, the flamboyant force behind Deep Purple and Rainbow, known as much for his medieval flair as for his bone-crushing riffs. But in the eyes of Jimmy Page, Blackmore wasn't a kindred spirit. He was a heretic. Their rivalry wasn't born from mere competition, but from clashing ideologies. While both men were pioneers of hard rock in the early 70s, their visions of what that meant couldn't have been further apart. Page was an architect of layered mysticism and raw blues expression, a craftsman who believed that music should evoke emotion first and spectacle second. Blackmore, on the other hand, leaned heavily into Renaissance theatrics, donning tights and bringing swords on stage, turning every concert into a historical pageant, each notoriously private and disdainful of anything he deemed frivolous, reportedly mocked this approach, once sneering to fellow session musicians that Blackmore thinks every song needs a bloody sword fight. The jab didn't stop there. Page allegedly went on to accuse him of confusing volume with passion, an unforgivable crime in the world of a purist. What grated on Page wasn't just the aesthetic, it was the underlying philosophy. Where Page sought to serve the song, Blackmore seemed to demand the song serve him, bending compositions to fit his flair for drama and bombast. This divergence infuriated Page, who saw such self-indulgence as the death of artistic authenticity. Their paths didn't often cross publicly, but when they did, the tension was unmistakable. At a London studio in 1974, Page is said to have walked out the moment Blackmore entered, grumbling to his roadie, "I don't have time for costume parties." That single moment, according to insiders, summed up their entire dynamic. Page, the stern spiritualist, refusing to share air with a man he saw as a theatrical interloper. Yet what made the feud even more fascinating was that it was seemingly one-sided. Blackmore, perhaps unaware or simply unbothered, occasionally praised Zeppelin's musical prowess, seemingly oblivious to the disdain directed at him. But to Page, Blackmore represented everything he stood against. A guitarist who played for the crowd, not the craft. A showman cloaked in velvet who, in Page's eyes, traded substance for spectacle. Behind the scenes, Page's comments grew sharper, more pointed, as he condemned unnamed guitarists who mistook flash for feeling. Though he never publicly named Blackmore in these critiques, industry insiders knew exactly who he meant. Because to Page, Blackmore's Renaissance obsession wasn't just theatrical fluff, was a betrayal of what guitar music was supposed to be. And in a world where Page demanded reverence for the sacred language of song, Blackmore was speaking. In riddles and riddled in costumes, the feud wasn't explosive, but it was enduring quiet contempt wrapped in velvet disdain. Asterisk. If Ritchie Blackmore's flamboyant stage persona irritated Jimmy Page, Eddie Van Halen's meteoric rise downright enraged him. The Dutch-American guitar prodigy didn't just change the rules of the game, he rewrote them with blistering speed. Revolutionary finger-tapping and a devil-may-care showmanship that made jaws drop and records fly off the shelves. But not everyone applauded the spectacle. Page, ever the spiritual craftsman, reportedly recoiled at what he saw as flash over feeling, style over substance. When Van Halen's debut album dropped in 1978, it ignited a tectonic shift in rock. Guitar, but in a London pub that same year. Page allegedly dismissed it all with chilling brevity. Anyone can learn parlor tricks. Real guitar playing comes from the heart, not from showing off like a circus performer. Word of the quote traveled fast. It hit hard. Eddie, for his part, often credited Page as an influence, even calling him the reason he picked up a guitar in the first place. But that admiration tragically, wasn't mutual. Page reportedly bristled at Eddie's brand of athletic guitar playing, a term he allegedly used to describe the emerging generation of fast-fingered shredders. To him, the soul of music was being replaced by technical masturbation, runs devoid of deeper meaning. Witnesses recall a chilling moment in a Los Angeles studio in 1980. Someone mentioned Van Halen's Eruption solo. Page reportedly snapped, "I've heard enough about bedroom noodling for one lifetime," before storming out. The contempt wasn't just professional, it was generational. Page saw himself as the last guardian of a sacred blues-rooted tradition, and Eddie as the ringleader of a circus that had hijacked the instrument's soul. Even as Van Halen reshaped modern rock, Page clung tightly to the belief that faster didn't mean better, louder didn't mean deeper, and more notes didn't equal more meaning. The feud remained one-sided in public. Eddie never retaliated, but behind the scenes, Page's disdain for the tapping phenomenon became a silent campaign to preserve what he considered real music. Because for Page, every pick stroke mattered, every bend had to bleed, and every solo had to serve something greater than applause. And when Eddie turned the guitar into an arena stunt, Jimmy saw not progress but betrayal. Asterisk, if Eddie Van Halen was a firecracker, Yngwie Malmsteen was a nuclear explosion, and Jimmy Page wanted nothing to do with the fallout. The flamboyant Swedish virtuoso stormed the 80s with an ego as grandiose as his solos, proclaiming himself the greatest guitarist to ever live and treating every concert like a royal recital. His Baroque-infused shredding, his disdain for blues traditions, and his relentless pursuit of technical dominance made him a god to some and a heretic to others. Page fell squarely in the latter camp. At a charity event, he allegedly muttered, "Two colleagues, this Swedish peacock thinks Bach wrote power chords." The man's confused technique with music itself. The disdain was instant and unrelenting. To Page, Malmsteen wasn't just missing the point, he was setting it on fire. While Page saw music as a channel for emotion, Yngwie turned it into an Olympic sport, one where speed, precision, and complexity replaced feel and soul. At a 1988 Guitar Expo, Page reportedly stood up mid-performance, turned to security and said, "I don't need to watch someone practice scales for 20 minutes. Then he left. The insult was vintage Page understated but devastating. Predictably, fired back in interviews, dismissing Zeppelin as primitive blues, noodling, and referring to Page's playing as outdated. But for Page, the issue wasn't a jit, it was authenticity. Saw Malmsteen's entire career as a cathedral built on academic narcissism, music that aimed to impress instead of inspire. It wasn't just a difference in style, it was war over the soul of the guitar. And in that war, Page believed his blues-soaked roots, his meticulous songwriting, and his dynamic arrangements carried a truth that no amount of arpeggios could ever match. To the world, Malmsteen was the future of metal guitar. To Page, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most gifted fingers can lose their way without a guiding heart. Asterisk, if Yngwie Malmsteen offended Jimmy Page by doing too much, Keith Richards angered him by doing far too little. Feud forged in the crucible of 1960s British rock simmered for decades, a cold war of clashing philosophies. Between the sonic architect of Led Zeppelin and the scrappy bluesman of the Rolling Stones, Page, the relentless perfectionist, believed in layering textures, sculpting atmospheres, and exploring the emotional depth of every note. Richards, on the other hand, championed rawness, spontaneity, and a three chords and a snarl approach. To rock and to Page, that wasn't rebellion, it was laziness. He reportedly told engineers, "Keith thinks 5 chords make him Chuck Berry. The man wouldn't recognize a melody if it bit him on his weathered R's." That brutal insult, circulating through London's tight-knit scene, lit the fuse for a rivalry that would span generations. Richards later returned the blow, allegedly snubbing Page backstage at Madison Square Garden and muttering, "Don't shake hands with thieves," a jab at Zeppelin's alleged lifting of blues standards. But the real battle wasn't personal, it was ideological. Page saw Richards as a symbol of anti-craft, a guitarist who coasted on attitude while dismissing nuance. Richards, for his part, saw Page as the opposite, overproduced, overlayered, and overthinking everything. While Richards celebrated grit, Page craved grandeur. While Richards chased groove, Page sculpted sonic architecture. Then, though both men revolutionized guitar in their own ways, they did so in mutual disdain. To Page, anyone could bash out satisfaction. But real musicianship required more than stumbling through the same riff for 50 years. The feud culminated in a quiet, stubborn silence, two legends on opposite sides of the musical spectrum, each convinced the other had sold the soul of rock to the wrong devil. Of all Jimmy Page's rumored rivalries, none carried more shock or more heartbreak than his reported contempt for Jimi Hendrix. Because while the world revered Hendrix as the undisputed guitar god, Page allegedly saw something else, a flashy interloper who arrived on the scene like a storm and immediately eclipsed everything in his path. The tension reportedly began in 1967, when Hendrix's wild London debut overshadowed Page's own meticulous session legacy. Friends claimed Page seethed privately, lamenting, "This American comes over here and suddenly everyone forgets who was playing guitar before he arrived." He viewed Hendrix's controlled chaos, his distortion-drenched theatrics and pyrotechnic solos, not as innovation, but as spectacle. Page, who believed every note should be deliberate, reportedly scoffed, "Real musicians don't need pyrotechnics," a barely veiled shot at Hendrix's fiery showmanship. The rivalry deepened when both men became linked through mutual acquaintances. In the London scene, Page growing increasingly paranoid that Hendrix was not just outperforming him but trying to erase him. Though Hendrix never publicly dissed Page, and even praised British musicianship, Page allegedly carried the grudge until Hendrix's death and beyond, once referring to his legacy as overrated theater. What fueled the bitterness wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. Fear that Hendrix had tapped into something elemental, something raw and primal that bypassed technique altogether. And to a craftsman like Page, that was both terrifying and infuriating. Even after Hendrix's passing, Page reportedly dismissed his genius in private, clinging to the belief that chaos could never equal craftsmanship. In truth, the feud was one-sided. Hendrix likely never knew the full extent of Page's animosity. But for Page, Hendrix was a ghost that haunted every solo, every review, every attempt to stand tallest on the mountain of rock. A ghost that had, in his view, stolen the spotlight before he even had a chance to claim it. Asterisk, no rivalry cut deeper than the one between Jimmy Page and Eric Clapton, feud forged not just in music, but in betrayal, ego, and decades of unresolved resentment. While fans revered Clapton as a guitar god, Page allegedly viewed him as the ultimate fraud, a man who built his career on borrowed brilliance, and who, in Page's mind, spent decades collecting praise for work that lacked innovation. The roots of their animosity trace back to London's mid-60s South blues scene, where both guitarists competed for the same gigs, same bands, and same session players. According to insiders, Page once spat two studio musicians. Eric plays the same 3 blues licks, and everyone calls him a god. "I suppose mediocrity sells better than innovation." That quote would set the tone for everything that followed. When Clapton later recruited drummer Jim Gordon, who had been working with Page, it was seen as a personal betrayal. Page allegedly told confidants, "Eric builds his career on other people's talent because he doesn't have enough of his own." The feud intensified through the 70s as both men soared to superstardom. Clapton leaned into classic blues, while Page layered mysticism, folklore, and thunder into his sound. But beneath the public civility was a deep, seething contempt. Page reportedly once quipped at a private party, "The difference between Eric and me is that I create music. He just copies it louder." And when Clapton subtly dismissed Zeppelin's heaviness in favor of blues purity, Page fired back by calling him a blues museum curator who had never written an original idea in his life. It wasn't just rivalry, it was warfare. A collision of two egos that shaped generations, each convinced that only one could truly claim the crown. And in Page's mind, Clapton had worn it for far too long without ever earning it. Asterisk behind every riff, every solo, every whispered grudge. One thing remains crystal clear. Jimmy Page wasn't just protecting a sound, he was defending a philosophy. For Page, the guitar was never just a tool. It was a sacred vessel of truth, one that demanded reverence, patience, and soul. And while the world moved faster, louder, and more theatrical, Page stood his ground like a storm-tossed sentinel, refusing to surrender the art form to what he saw as gimmickry or ego. His rivalries, whether steeped in jealousy, hurt pride, or philosophical conviction, weren't just personal vendettas. They were battles for the soul of rock. And yet, for all his brilliance, Page's legacy is as much defined by who he resented as by what he created. In scorning others, he revealed the immense weight he carried, the pressure to remain untouchable, the fear of being outshined, the burden of guarding an era that was slipping away. Love him or loathe him, one cannot deny that Page's path was forged not only in the fires of genius, but also in the shadows of rivalry. And as we look back on these 6 legendary feuds, one question remains: were they signs of a man defending his craft, or of a man haunted by the fear that his time had passed?